Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so delighted you've joined me this evening, wherever you are in the world. But before we get started, don't forget to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa or coffee, because I've got a fabulous story for you. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. You're really going to love tonight's story, because if you're like me and you enjoy blueberries, this is a very interesting story indeed, and it's got a very exciting twist to it. So let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Alice. My Bigfoot encounter happened to me in 2007 when I was about 17 years old at the time. I grew up in the Kentucky countryside on a very large working 100-acre organic blueberry farm that is tucked away on a private country road, but is not too far from immediate facilities like hospitals, restaurants and shopping that are only about a 20-minute drive away. I live in an enchanting, beautiful whitewashed farmhouse that is about 2,000 square feet and was designed for us specifically by a well-renowned architect who created a sumptuous retreat for us that would epitomize that cozy country feeling by incorporating large stone fireplaces throughout, while at the same time emphasizing the stunning views on our property over the rolling green emerald hills and the pretty idyllic pastures. He did this by incorporating large, more modern-style windows that truly made the most of the exquisite scenery of our property. Our architect managed to flawlessly marry the old and the new together so seamlessly to create our ideal dream home. The initial property was an 1800s farmhouse, but its foundations and shoddy, badly built structure were completely unsalvageable, and so we built a brand new home from scratch in about 1995. Our farm overlooks gorgeous views of emerald green countryside, undulating valleys, pretty lily-covered ponds, and a couple of gushing streams that meander throughout the valley. On the left-hand side of our land, we have an area that quite literally we call the woods, and it's a place that is frequented by many of the local wild animals, like the pretty white-tailed deer and other indigenous species so typical to Kentucky. I grew up on our Kentucky farm with my mother, father and two sisters, and as it's a working farm, we often employ outside help to manage our blueberry crop, which can be a huge undertaking at certain times of the year, especially during the harvesting seasons of blueberries, as when you pick the blueberries you need to make sure you remove the ripe ones, leaving the green ones still on their stems, using a very gentle roll of the thumb technique to increase the longevity of the berries and subsequent shelf life. We tend to hand-pick the blueberries the first couple of times, and then one of our farming machines sweep the bushes for the final berries. These are the berries we will sell for the purposes of freezing only, and we have 3 types of blueberries that we grow on our farm that are harvested early, mid-season and late season. And because they're different blueberry species, they taste subtly different, which is why the blueberries you buy don't always taste the same. You might have noticed that. The best tasting and most delicious blueberries are invariably not grown on farms because, put simply, the berries are way too delicate and the bushes far too sensitive for any of our farms to actually cultivate. But these blueberries do have the best taste of all. You can grow them from a seed catalogue or pick up a box at your local farmer's market. But invariably, the best blueberries you'll ever find are those that you naturally forage for in the wild. Anyway, enough about blueberries and on with my story that ultimately led to an extraordinary encounter with a Bigfoot. My story began pretty soon after a strange experience at our home. As I told you, we hire people to help us with hand-picking of blueberries, and although we try to make sure that all those workers we hire are indeed reliable and trustworthy, you cannot always guarantee that. One morning I was lying in my bedroom, fast asleep, and the curtains on my window had been marginally drawn. I was suddenly awoken to a strange tapping sound on the glass window. I know this part may sound rather peculiar to you, but do remember I was in a sleepy state. I looked towards my window, and there was one of our farm workers staring at me blatantly and sticking his tongue out at me and making strange contorted facial expressions at the window, none that were remotely funny. I just got out of the bed slowly, in that state of semi-consciousness, and pulled the curtain to block out the worker's face, and then I went back to sleep. I do not know why I reacted like this. You would have thought that the man's peculiar facial expressions would have aroused me from my sleep, but I imagine I was just way too drowsy at the time to really perceive what was actually going on. It must have been 5 minutes later when I sensed a presence in my bedroom, and I felt a very solid, bulky form sitting at the end of the bed. I initially thought it was my father, but imagine my horror when I looked up to see a strange man sitting at the end of my bed, studying me with menacingly evil eyes and ogling me far too intently for my liking, making me feel incredibly uncomfortable. Now I really was awake and alert, I can assure you. I knew at once that this was the same wacko man that had been making faces at me outside the window only moments before. He was a tall, willowy man with a sallow, rugged complexion and very deep-set, intense-looking hazel eyes that were so unsettling. I really got the distinct impression that this man was unstable and unhinged, and I needed to tread carefully, as my life could potentially be in perilous danger. I realised he must have got into our house by going through the kitchen door. As you can imagine, I was terrified. What was this cuckoo farm worker doing sitting at the end of my bed, I thought. I knew that his villainous intentions were nefariously evil and despicable, and I wanted to scream, but my gut instinct persuaded me to act as if everything was customarily normal. On reflection, I do believe that if I'd screamed out in terror, this crazy, duplicitous man might have killed me. Luckily, I'm a good actress, and so I stayed incredibly calm and continued to act as if it was perfectly normal for him to be sitting at the end of my bed, which was clearly not the case. "What do you want?" I asked him. "A light for my cigarette," he said. I then proceeded to call my sister. "Julia!" I called, "Julia!" I didn't want to raise my voice in a way that might suggest I was actually afraid, so I called out for my sister, enunciating my words in a monotone voice. I did not want this man to even suspect that I was remotely apprehensive about his presence in my bedroom, as I believe that such a revelation may have caused him to become frantic and even more deranged, as he was seriously mentally unstable, let's not kid. As luck would have it, Julia was walking past my bedroom at the time when she heard me calling out her name, and then she entered my room. "What's up, sis?" she asked, gasping in horror when she saw the strange farm worker sitting on the end of my bed. She knew immediately that we had a very big problem, but she maintained her cool, easygoing expression so that the man remained oblivious to the rising consternation between the both of us. I felt waves of relief flooding over my body. I knew that with two of us and one of him, I was instantly much safer. I said to Julia in a nonchalant way that this man wanted a light for his cigarette. Julia sensed what I was doing and why I was acting in such an indifferent, aloof manner, as if it was normal for me to have a strange person sitting at the end of my bed, uninvited and seemingly very cosy. Together we persuaded the man to come to the kitchen to get a light for his cigarette, as we both knew that my mother was likely to be preparing breakfast by now, and with the three of us together, we could surely get rid of this crazy man from our home. To cut a long story short, we gave the farmhand some matches, and my mother directed him back to the berry fields, where he proceeded to work the rest of the day, obliviously unaware that we were deciding between all of us how to deal with this mentally unstable man who could potentially cause us grievous bodily harm. We kept a close eye on him all day, and once he'd completed his shift, my father told the farmhand we would no longer be requiring his services any more. Looking back, we should really have called the police immediately, instead until waiting for him to finally leave before we alerted them to what had actually transpired. As you can imagine, my parents were mortified by this man's unbalanced, ludicrous behaviour, and after he left, we immediately reported the strange incident to the police. But when the police went to interview him, he was nowhere to be found, and his house appeared to be vacated, almost as if he had chosen to disappear intentionally. I gather the neighbour who had not seen him for a while described him as a creepy weirdo. After a week had passed, my family began to relax again, and thoughts of the strange farm worker and his psychotic, balmy behaviour had long since dissipated. It was on a bright, sunny, cheerful Tuesday morning when I went into surgery for a compacted wisdom tooth and some tooth extractions, and I returned home later that evening to recuperate. I was not able to talk because of the swelling of my gums, and it was so bad, and my mouth so terribly swollen, I could barely speak at all. I was experiencing a dull, throbbing pain in my jaw that was only marginally curtailed by a strong painkiller that I'd been given by the orthodontist. That evening, my two sisters and my mother and dad were going to a relative's 80th birthday party, but I knew that I'd not be able to accompany them for this special occasion, so I resigned myself to being left alone for the entire evening. I was disappointed because this relative of ours, a man called Johnny, was particularly special to me. "Are you sure you're going to be all right on your own?" my mother asked, with a worried expression on her face. "I'll be fine, Mum," I scribbled out on a notepad that I was using for the purposes of communication as I couldn't speak. "I don't feel good leaving you in this condition, but it would be rude not to go to Johnny's 80th. After all, you only turn 80 once." "Mum, I'll be fine," I insisted, scribbling my note down on the piece of paper. "Go and enjoy yourself, and please stop worrying about me. I'm old and ugly enough to manage on my own," I wrote. "Ugly you most certainly are not," my mother said, kissing me on the cheek. "But you have looked better before." She laughed, examining my swollen mouth. "I see the swelling has not gone down much," she said, sitting down on my bed and examining my lower left cheek, that was quite literally the size of an extended melon. "Go, Mum," I wrote. "Please, I promise you I'll be fine." "If you're sure," said my mother hesitantly. "We'll be back very soon, I promise." I could hear my parents arguing about me in the entrance hall. "The police have not caught that farm worker of mine," said my father. "Is it wise to leave her on her own in such a vulnerable condition? I mean, she can barely talk. What if she needs to phone us for something?" "Look, everything is bolted," said my mother. "I think she's pretty safe in here. Let's go. We won't be long." I could hear their car driving down our gravel road, and I sighed with relief because I wanted them to enjoy the party, and I was sure I was going to be absolutely fine. I'd never had issues of being left alone before in the past. Why would this evening be any different? And besides, I was not predisposed to anxiety. I read a few magazines, ate a little jello and custard because I was only allowed to eat soft food, upon my orthodontist's strict instructions. I was exhausted from the operation, so I retired to bed very early. I know this sounds really strange, and I honestly do not know how to explain it to you, but I woke up with a bolt, like the unexplained feeling you get when you suddenly jump out of your skin for some reason or other. I looked up around my bedroom and felt a really big sense of impending dread. I knew something was terribly wrong, and I could feel it in my gut. I heard nothing, nor did I observe anything, but I just knew something was off. So I reached for my bedside lamp and switched it on, and then pulled out my flashlight from inside my bedside drawer. My parents had left almost all of our house in darkness, apart from the outside light on the porch and a light on in our kitchen. Everything was locked up with double bolts, and I should have felt very safe, but I didn't feel secure at all. I was beginning to feel incredibly anxious, and my heart began to pound in my chest like a heavy drum. It was as if I knew unconsciously that something really horrendous was about to happen. I immediately tiptoed around the house, quietly peeking through all the windows to see if I could see any suspicious sign of movement in our yard. And it was when I was glancing through a side window that overlooked my bedroom that I saw him. I could not believe what I was seeing. There was no mistaking who it was. It was the insidiously evil farm worker, the very same man who'd been sitting at the end of my bed only a week before. I felt sick to my stomach, and I felt like I wanted to throw up violently as this bitter taste of bile kept rising up in my throat, leaving a very unpalatable sour taste in my mouth. In utter horror and complete revulsion, I realised that the farm worker, I kid you not, had stripped completely naked outside my bedroom window and folded all his clothes in a neat pile on the outside mantel. It would not take a rocket science to know what this man's intentions were towards me. But I don't want to say the words, and don't make me do it, because it just gives me the creeps. I watched him climbing through my bedroom window. He had removed the large pane of glass with masterful precision and laid it carefully on the ground. He pulled back my curtain and crept into my bedroom. The most horrifying thing of all was that this huge knobbly hands of his held a massive machete knife that I knew was meant for me. And in that horrifying moment of revelation, I knew I needed to get out of the house as fast as I possibly could. That was clear. I wasted no time in getting out of my house. I was trying not to panic, but I was petrified and terrified all at once. I was so scared that the man would find me and pounce on me. I knew he intended to harm me and possibly even kill me. I tiptoed into my parents' bedroom window on the furthest side of the house, quite a long way away from my bedroom. My hands were wobbling and trembling violently as I pulled up the lever and climbed out of the window, doing my level best to be as quiet as I possibly could, and I just hightailed it to the woods as fast as I possibly could. I didn't have a cell phone with me, but it wouldn't have been much use anyway, as I couldn't string any words together with my swollen mouth and was barely able to talk. So even phoning 911 was not even a fleeting consideration for me. I want to tell you that never in my entire life have I been more afraid or anxious about anything, but in that moment I could not think of anything other than escaping, and the woods seemed like the perfect hiding place, as there was a plethora of the tall cypress, red maple and beech trees there, not to mention lots of undergrowth and fallen timber. It was an excellent place to hide out, I thought. As I entered the wood, it was quite light because it was a full moon on that evening, and the light of the pearly moon and the silvery stars danced through the canopy, providing a beautiful, gentle light. I could hear all the frogs in the valley croaking, and the orchestra of crickets, including the familiar owl calls and the sounds of coyotes in the distance, and their calls did have a strangely soothing, calming effect upon me. I looked around for somewhere to hide, and I found a large bush that I could weave myself under, which is what I did. Funny enough, it was not too uncomfortable, as the ground beneath was strangely soft and spongy. I decided I'd stay hidden until light, just in case that crazed lunatic was snooping around looking for me. Suddenly I heard the heavy footsteps in the woods that sounded like they were of an enormous human being. But in my irrational, fearful state, I perceived that the deranged the farm worker had seen me entering the woods and was now in hot pursuit of me. I just lay on the ground, very, very still, hardly daring to breathe, as I was scared that he would be able to hear my breath. I was utterly petrified, and my body was frozen in utter terror. The farm worker whistled happily to himself, and sat on the ground not far from where I was actually hiding. In that moment a horrifying thought occurred to me. Was he toying with me, because he knew where I was hiding? I was almost sure that this was the case. I peeked through the bush to see if I could get a glimpse of what I thought would be the farm worker, and see what he was actually doing. But imagine my surprise and utter consternation when I realized that I was not looking at the farm worker, but a Bigfoot. I could see the creature very clearly, as the moonlight came streaming through, lighting up the dark hair of the creature. I was astounded, amazed, bewildered and shocked all at once. I could hardly believe what I was actually seeing, but there he was, sitting there, yards away from me, larger than life. I knew it was the Bigfoot because of the coverage I'd seen on TV before on a program called Finding Bigfoot. I remember listening to that program with a curious, keen interest, but never really believing that spurious sightings of these creatures were actually real. But there was no mistaking that this was the humanoid ape known as Bigfoot. What else could it possibly be? I think it must have been about 10 foot tall, 900 pounds and 5 feet wide, and it appeared colossal and jumbo in size. In the dusky light, I got a glimpse of the cone-shaped head and the bright red eyeshine. The creature was squatting on the ground, eating some strange green leaves, and on the forest floor, and there were also piles of blueberries there that he appeared to be enjoying. He appeared to be wrapping the berries in the leaves and eating them like a sandwich, and clearly enjoying his vegetarian snack, as he kept making appreciative, noises that you make when you enjoy something in your throat. As I lay there, I remember thinking that everything was happening on this night was something out of a movie, because it was so theatrical, but I had no idea that things were about to get a whole lot worse and a whole lot more dramatic. It was like Steven Spielberg production unfolding before my very eyes, only this wasn't fake, it was bone-chillingly real, and I was the leading star in this incredible performance. I could hear the sounds of a car driving towards our home as it carried into the woods. I could hear the excitable voices of my parents and my sisters, who had clearly just come back, as they had vehemently promised that they would not be long, and they had stuck to their words. Suddenly then I heard this loud panting of someone who was out of breath and running very, very fast, and they were running towards the woods in a frantic hurry. Who was this person, I wondered? And to my shock and horror I realized it was the farm worker, from whom I had been desperately trying to escape. Could this nightmare get any worse, I wondered? I suddenly discerned that the farm worker had been hiding out in these woods all along, possibly for many long days, and I'd literally walked straight into the viper's nest, like a bird hanging around a sparrowhawk, simply waiting to be devoured. I imagined he'd been camping out in the woods all this time while spying on my family and waiting for an opportune moment to carry out his duplicitous, scheming attack on me. No wonder the police couldn't find him. He'd been hiding out in our woods all along. Talk about bad luck or blatant stupidity and ignorance on my part, I thought to myself. The worker scooted into the wood, and he was now fully dressed in a pair of khaki pants and a white polo shirt. He was carrying the machete in his hands and a box of tools that he had clearly used to prise open my window with. In those few seconds of horrifying revelation, I was so numb and paralysed with shock that I felt almost emotionally disconnected to the abysmal scene that started to unfold before my very eyes, and literally it happened in seconds, but believe me, those seconds felt like hours. They were that harrowing. The next thing I knew was that the man's machete was flying through the air and landed just centimetres away from my bush, so I reached out with my arm and very quietly dragged it under the bush so that it was now lying beside me. Now I had a weapon to defend myself with, I thought with relief, and if the worst came to the worst, I might be forced to have to use it. Suddenly I heard the worker screaming, "No, no, no, please no!" And I realised with horror that the Bigfoot was attacking the now very alarmed worker. "No, no, no!" The hairy beast growled aggressively at the man, letting out the most terrifying, savage, thunderous roar that was equally as intense as that of a lion. I was utterly terrified of that sound, as it really sent waves and shivers down my spine of absolute dread. I was in no doubt that the Bigfoot was about to tear the worker into shreds, and believe me, I wasn't wrong. I watched in absolute horrified disbelief as this Herculean-sized creature lifted the worker in the air. The panic-sized man was wiggling his legs and fighting back with all his might, but he looked so pathetically tiny and puny in the Goliath monster's hands. The Bigfoot twisted the man until the body was hanging upside down and head facing only a centimetre above the ground. He was now holding the man by his lower legs with powerful hands. He smashed the workman's body and swung it violently like a huge cricket bat, forcefully against the girth of a large tree, hammering and pounding the man until the head literally broke open and splattered apart, and large clumps of blubbery pieces of body fat, brain, skin and connective tissue, as well as large clots of blood, were splattered everywhere, littering the forest floor in a sludgy mess. The rest of the man's mangled body and jagged bones lay in a limp heap on the ground. I promise you that is how quick his death was. It was brutal, murderous, but very fast. The Bigfoot creature made a few more grunts and proceeded to eat the berries and leaves, seemingly unfazed by the dead pulverized body that literally lay yards away from him. He truly seemed emotionally disconnected to what just had transpired. I was terrified that if this Bigfoot got to see me, that he might kill me in the same heinous way that he had attacked the farm worker. So I lay under the bush until the early hours of the morning. During the night I had heard the gobbling sounds of 2 coyotes stuffing the remnants of the pulverized flesh down their hungry throats. After a while, one of the coyotes, I think he got a whiff of my human scent, and then just bolted off. To cut a long story short, both my parents had no idea what had transpired that night, as they thought that I was fast asleep when they returned, and had decided not to disturb me. It appeared that when the workman discovered I was not at home, he covered up his tracks and replaced my window ever so carefully after he had removed it, so skillfully, probably with the macabre intention of coming back when I was in the house again. I imagined he'd just finished the job when my parents returned home, and everything seemed in its place, so none of their suspicions were remotely aroused, although my mother did comment that she wondered why her large bedroom window was left unhinged, but never gave it a second thought. She thought that my father may have been trying to air the room out. The police discovered that the man had been camping out in our woods, and they found his tent, food supplies, and a whole bunch of housebreaking tools. It was believed he was behind the murder of a few more missing women who were presumed dead, but bodies never found. I know I was lucky to escape this evil man, whom they did conclude had psychotic disorders. The police actually said to my father that it was a good thing that the man was now deceased, but they had no idea what had killed him. By the time they recovered his remains, he had pretty much been fully consumed by all the predators. I never told the police that it was a Bigfoot that had actually killed the man. I have no idea whether the Bigfoot would have harmed me or not if he had seen me, but that is something I will never know the answer to. A small part of me hopes that he knew I was hiding under the bush and chose to kill my attacker to protect me. I do hope that that is the case, but I guess I'll never know the answer to that question, but that is my story. All I want to say to you is that is the most phenomenal story. In fact, reading it, I am sweating in my palms. I'm actually shaking. I hope I didn't come across shaking when I read it, but it absolutely terrified me. I was absolutely frozen to the spot reading the story, so I hope I read it well enough for you. It just terrified me reading it. So I don't know what to say to that. You can hear me shaking now. Wow, that's all I can say. Until next time, goodbye and good night.